Welcome to Casual Conversations. My name is Katherine Snedaker, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the CEO and founder of PINK Concussions. I am thrilled to have you here today for my guest, Dr. Willie Stewart, and I want to thank IBIA and NABIS for their hosting of this show, and we will be having a large event with them in this September in New York City. So right now, I would like to welcome from Glasgow, Dr. Willie Stewart. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it was great. So we spoke over a year ago, and that was a great show. And just for those that didn't make that show, I just wanted to do a little bit. Where did you grow up?
Glasgow. I haven't traveled far.
You haven't traveled far. And I think if I recall, it was a professor that first interested you in working in brain injury or the brain.
So I was training in pathology and completing a PhD in neuroscience at the same time, and doing my delayed write-up as all bad PhDs do. And the then professor of neuropathology called me into his office to have a chat, and his office was across the campus from the hospital. And he called me in to have a chat. And I thought, why does this guy want to speak to me? So I went along, and he basically just sat me down in his office and told me over the space of an hour why I would be a neuropathologist, because of my pathology interest, my research science background in neuroscience. And then I listened to it, and I said, yeah, okay, that's something to consider. And then I gave in and kind of let him have his way. But the thing in Glasgow is that Glasgow's research interest in neurosciences at that time and for 30, 40 years before was in brain injury. So I landed in the department to train in this fantastic specialty of neuropathology, where there was a really strong interest in brain injury and brain injury outcomes. And so that's how I kind of, if you like, fell into or was dragged into research in neurotrauma.
And when I came to visit you there, you also showed me a collection that, I don't know if the right word is inherited, but was passed to you from an expert in the field before. Do you want to share about that?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate to be. I mean, we describe it as custodian. So I'm
Custodian.
looking after. Yeah, I'm custodian of the Glasgow Traumatic Brain Injury Archive, and it was set up. Would it be almost 60 years ago now? 50 odd years ago now. Following a meeting in NIH where international experts got together, believe it or not, to discuss the latent effects of brain injury, and one of the things that came out of that conversation was we're never going to understand the latent effects of brain injury if we don't understand what brain injury looks like down a microscope. So if we're not doing the pathology studies back in those days, we're never going to make any advances in understanding brain injury. And so the delegates at that workshop left with a call to arms for various things. One of them was to establish brain donation programs to be able to try and understand this really complex pathology. And I think possibly, as far as I can tell, the only one that actually was established was in Glasgow. The delegates from Glasgow came back and said, look, this is something we should start. And so around about 1970, the Glasgow Traumatic Brain Injury Archive began to set up and has really been running continuously since then. The case accrual has changed. For the first 30 years or so, it was very much acute injury. So people who sadly were being hit by a car and passing away in the first week or so. But in the last 10 to 15 years, we've really been getting material from people who have donated to us, who have survived quite a while after injury. So typically athletes, late surviving road traffic incidents.
And then when I last saw you, we launched the Pink Brain Pledge and had some amazing female athletes, current and former, speak about brain donation. And I just have to say, the press was so supportive. BBC Scotland, BBC, all the newspapers. How was the response while you and I were there and doing interviews was great. What did you see with brain donation after that?
So it was great, as you say. There's kind of two parts to the sort of our archive, the way it works. One is people who register their wish that the end of life that we should be passed the brain to include in our archive and do our research and evaluation on. And then the second is that where the brains are donated to us. The registration one is really important because that gives people the ability at the time of death to be able to make sure the right thing happens. And frustration is a lot of people, families contact us after somebody's died and who hasn't known about us or hasn't known about the archive, and desperately trying to find out how best to have material come to us for evaluation and research. And that can be quite difficult. So this is just an advanced directive, if you like, saying in the event, please, could that happen? Now it's been fantastic. We continue to have really good connections and contacts from people who are interested in registering for brain donation. We had an upsurge in female brain injury survivors' interest, and recently with a research program which we may discuss, looking at midlife brain health in former athletes, where we've asked for female athletes to engage. We've had another surge in interest, and so it's great. I mean, I think that's the thing, that there's so little research in female brain injury, female athletes, and it's not because participants are not out there wanting to participate. It's just we're not connecting with them. So when you offer them connection, there's this surge of enthusiasm. In terms of actual donations for us, there have been far fewer of those. There always are. Donated brains that come to us are really precious, but don't come to us so often. That's not necessarily a terribly bad thing, because we're these people who register in their 40s and 50s, we're in no rush to see their brains.
Absolutely.
We're no rush. We're no rush. We're not expecting it to come to us quickly.
So there's so much more awareness out there. I think CTE has moved past, oh, I saw that on the movie, or that's a football player thing. I think that there is momentum, that we have worked so hard to create awareness, and yet also balancing, and I'm sure you see it, I see it almost weekly, where someone calls and says, I have pre-CTE, I know I have CTE, I had 3 soccer, and there's the sort of balancing of how do you create interest without creating panic. And we have talked in the past about assigning that you have a chronic progressive disease with no cure is a really hard mental place for then to work on your own health. So could we just review where we are today of, a quick description, layperson description of what CTE is as we know it today? And you can go back, we've talked 5-10 years ago, and the definition has changed and the understanding has changed. So could you just give us, and I really do believe that you have such a balanced view of CTE being a piece in the rainbow, the perspective of other neurological, but could you give sort of a layperson's of where we are today?
Yeah, so the story of our understanding of CTE goes back almost a century to first awareness that boxers could develop late life problems. So retire, leave the game, leave the sport of boxing, and many decades later develop a degenerative brain disease, which was quite distinct. So they had tremor problems, they had memory problems, behavioral problems. It took some time, just as we've discussed, for brains to begin to be looked at down a microscope. And when people started to look down a microscope, they began to see pathologies down a microscope which were very similar to the descriptions that were then around of Alzheimer's disease, but just looked a bit different. So similar proteins, similar abnormalities, but just slightly different to Alzheimer's disease. What's happened in the last decade or so is that we've really nailed down what the differences are. So we can now look down a microscope at the brain of somebody who has a dementia syndrome, a degenerative brain disease, and actually see the distinctive pathology that defines this CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And what we see down a microscope is proteins similar to what you see in Alzheimer's disease, but they're deposited in a very very stereotypical, very, very distinctive pattern. And that's how we make the diagnosis. But that's just a pathology. That doesn't necessarily tell us what somebody was dealing with in life. The pathology that we see under the microscope and what's happening in life are often related, but not always related. So it's really important when we do our examinations to spend all that time with the family and going through the clinical case records and trying to extract the story of how they were behaving, what was happening in life. And that's where we are now.
And that's that balancing of this. Every time you say microscope, that is somebody that is deceased and the brain has been prepared and looked at through a microscope. This can't be done on a living person. And that you can, see something in the microscope, but until you've talked to the family and found out about this person, you can't pull all of that together to come up with a diagnosis. And it's important to have all those pieces together.
It is, but it's an important thing though, that often it's said that a diagnosis of CTE can't be made until a post-mortem has been conducted. And if we're being really honest, a certain diagnosis of any of these degenerative brain diseases can't be made until a post-mortem has been conducted. The difference with Alzheimer's disease is that we've got a better understanding of what a patient with Alzheimer's disease might appear like in clinic, might appear like in the community, might appear like to their family. So we understand the symptoms, the changes that somebody may have in behavior with Alzheimer's disease, and we can kind of classify those. And we know some tests that we can do that might help us make that diagnosis. But actually, frequently, that diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is incorrect. And actually, if we take the time to look down a microscope, we find out a patient may have another disease altogether. It's just that it looked like Alzheimer's disease. And that happens. If you take our practice with CTE, for instance, rarely does a footballer or rugby player come to us with a diagnosis of CTE. More often than not, the diagnosis is Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or frontal temporal dementia or something else. When we look down a microscope, we find it's CTE. So strictly speaking, any dementia diagnosis, to be absolutely certain of what it is, needs to be looked at down a microscope. It's just we're better at predicting what the disease is in these more common diseases. However, if we're going to predict, if we're going to play the odds on a diagnosis of CTE, in our athletes with dementia, 3/4 of the brains when we examine them have CTE in them. So I always say to my clinical colleagues dealing with this problem in clinic, is that if you've got a footballer in front of you, if you want to play the odds, if you want to guess the most likely diagnosis, CTE 75% of the time, and 3 out of 4 patients will be the correct diagnosis, not the least likely diagnosis. So we're needing to get better at recognizing it. But if we don't acknowledge that actually all these diseases are difficult to diagnose, then we may always have this hurdle where we just don't believe that CTE can be diagnosed, but it can.
And then looking at the brain of somebody as we get older and looking at older brains, if you look at someone in the 70s and the 80s, there are the tau, and there's so much going on in those brains. Can you sort it out later in life in that point?
Yeah, it becomes more challenging. And age is not good for brains. If there's one thing we know is the older you get, the tougher it is on your brain. And if we go back to just dementia in the community, we used to always talk of, this patient has Alzheimer's disease, this patient has frontotemporal dementia. And we weren't really being honest there, because when we looked down a microscope, we saw that they had the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, but they also would have pathology of vascular dementia and possibly pathology of frontotemporal dementia. They had a mixture of different things happening. But we just would say they had a single diagnosis because it seemed simpler than being honest and saying all the different things were happening. And the older you get, the more complex pathology gets. So if you're in your 60s or 70s and you develop dementia, then you may just have one single dominant pathology. Alzheimer's pathology may be the single dominant pathology. When you get to the oldest old, 85, 90, then when we look at the brains of people who with dementia at that age, we find a whole host of things happening, and it can be really difficult to pick apart which one of these has been leading to the dementia problem, because there's just so much. Now, the interesting thing is in the athlete brains that we look at with dementia, no matter what age they are, we see this pathology of the oldest old. So a 60-year-old footballer with dementia will have a brain that looks very much like an 85, 90-year-old person in the community who's never played football. There's so much pathology going on there. So it can be a real challenge trying to pick out amongst all the different pathologies, which one has been driving or responsible for the dementia. But we do know 3/4 of them, there's this distinct head injury pathology, CTE there, and that's got to be important.
That's fascinating. And there's several different groups here. There's, I'm alive, I have this history, I'm having these problems. What can the research tell me now about me? There's researchers who have brains, people have passed on, and what can you figure out that's useful to the researchers there? And then there's also organizations that, you know, are trying to fundraise and lead an agenda because they need the fundraising to do the research, you know, and their narrative as CTE is, you know, I need to excite the population to learn about this, to fundraise, to be part of it. So everybody's got their own, you know, sort of angles. What about the research do we know right now that's helpful for people that are alive?
So there's two things. One is that we know the CTE is intimately linked, so far only described in people with a history of head injury. And in the majority of these instances, it's repetitive head injury. So it's sports exposures, military exposures, and occasional cases that have been looked at where it's been a different part of violence. So repetitive brain injury. So in that respect, the research is really helpful because we can cure this problem. We can solve this problem immediately. We just stop repeatedly injuring ourselves over the head. We look at sport and say, in soccer, do you need to head the ball 100 times during the week to be able to score the goal on Saturday, or is there another way of doing things? Is there a smarter way of doing things?
And I was there when you were speaking with top people about passing that rule to limit heading in Scotland. You know, it's people like you that go forward and like, why are these kids doing this? Let's not, you know, and
it's such a frustration because unfortunately, after over a century of efforts trying to cure dementia or treat dementia, nothing works. You know, no drug does any good for us with dementia. We've had all this effort, we haven't managed to do it. So we've got to try a new way, and the new way is to try and prevent it. So here's an easy win. We can prevent CTE, just stop hitting each other over the head so often, or hitting ourselves on the head so often. That's fine for current and future players. We've got the solution for them. We just have to convince sport to get, you know, on board with it. That's a really tough challenge, but we're doing it. The second is what research can tell us is that, okay, so you've played sport, you've played at the high level, you've played soccer, you've played football, you've played rugby, you know, whatever, and you're no longer playing, you've left the game, you're in your 40s, 50s, and you know, playing those sports is a memory. So you've probably taken that damage with you. You know, you've left the game with the damage from head injuries. There's nothing we can do to repair the damage that the game has left you. What we can do though is sit down and say, well, traumatic brain injury is a risk factor for dementia, but there are another 11 that we recognize that are also risk factors for dementia, another 11 potentially modifiable things in our lifestyle and in our health that we can influence, that can reduce our risk of dementia. So what we can do is sit down with people in their 40s who've left a game of, you know, football, or left football with potential damage from heading or other injuries, and say, okay, trauma, put that to the side. Sorry, we can't do much about that. What are these other 11 things? You know, what's your blood pressure? What's your diet? What's your physical activity like? How much alcohol do you take in? And work on those. And for the moment, that's the best we've got, but you know, it's better than nothing. And if we can try and optimize these, we might just be able to reduce these ex-athletes, these people with risk of dementia's risk from considerable. Footballers, soccer players, risk is about 3.5 times higher than it should be. Maybe we'll be able to cut that to, you know, double the risk. I don't know if we'll get it back to normal expectations and risk, but we can at least bring it down towards something which is nearer normal. And so we can do that. Unfortunately, the late life people who develop disease, we still have no answers there. We still have nothing that we can figure out there. But what we do know is that good support is needed, because these are the athletes that we see with CTE are a distinctive population. So the pathology, the dementia is different, but physically they're different as well. They tend to be fit men in their 60s and 70s who are, used to physical activity, used to being independent, and are now dealing with a neurodegenerative disease, and that presents a challenge. So we need to work on best support and care for that group.
And I think it's just always really important to talk about the 11 other factors, and to, I mean, I'll just personally use myself in 2010 and 11, where I was reading about this and I pledged my brain and I was looking at my symptoms and really struggling after about 20 concussions. And what I discovered was a ADHD diagnosis, where once I went on medication, a lot of those symptoms went away, and I really haven't concussed since I went on medication, and actually have, the impulsiveness to jump on a stool underneath a door frame to grab something or get in a car too fast. So for me, an incredible focus on CTE was misaligned because I was a female missed with an ADHD diagnosis. So I think it's important to look at one's background and look at other possible things. I just see people that have latched on to CTE as being their future, and it's a really dark and I think deadly tunnel for some people. So that's a struggle. So it's really important where you're talking about the 11 other factors.
And that's you've raised a really important point, is that a diagnosis of neurodegenerative disease should not be given lightly, because, as I've said, with no treatment for it, the prospects are not good for it. The outcome is inevitable, progressive decline. So we should not be giving that diagnosis lightly. In particular, when patients are young, that diagnosis should not be given with no prospect of taking it back again. So we have, one of the things that the clinic we're setting up in rugby and other sports soon is to consider the other reasons why people may be developing symptoms which are very similar to dementia, memory problems, etc. Particularly in the younger ages. At younger ages, it's more likely there's something else wrong with you than you've got dementia. So it's more likely you've got a mental health disorder or anxiety or something else happening, which is giving you very similar symptoms to dementia, and can be convincing in clinic and convincing at home that you've got a dementia syndrome. But the reality is these are treatable problems. And that what we can do is we can work with the patients, the athletes, and treat those problems. And hopefully, in a year or 2 years' time, actually be able to take that, that possibility of a dementia diagnosis away from them and say, look, we think we've solved the problem. That's not to say that 10 or 15 years' time, we won't be having to give it back, but at least we've dealt with that in the 40-year-olds. We're not telling them they've got something which is an incurable, relentless, progressive disease that we've no treatment for.
No, absolutely. And then, so from the perspective of researchers and looking at people's brains, people that have been deceased, looking at brains and trying to figure out, how do we define CTE? And I spoke to Dr. Bob Cantu, and years ago, there was no way to put a scale on concussion. There was just concussion. And so he came up with the grading system of grade 1, 2, 3, and 4, and he graded it by loss of consciousness. And it gave them some language. It gave them, like the Glasgow coma scale. It gives people a scale. In the long run, it turned out it wasn't the right scale because it was missing 90% of the concussions that didn't have loss of consciousness. But I was talking to him and he's like, that's what no one had anything out there. I threw something out there and, we were working with that. I think in the same way, people are trying to say, okay, let's break down CTE. There was a staging system that Ann McKee presented, and I was at an NIH meeting where there were discussions on whether that could be replicated. Where are we today with, we have CTE, and how can researchers break that down into some subsets?
Yeah, so I mean, this is really important. We are, although, as I say, outcomes from brain injury in sport we've known about for about 100 years. In reality, in terms of research and understanding, we're only 20 years into this battle. So we're still learning, we're still developing all the criteria and tools that we need to use for that. Think of Alzheimer's disease. That's been around for 100 years, and we're still refining Alzheimer's disease understanding even now. So CTE, the modern understanding 20 years in, it's going to take us a bit longer yet to figure it all out. However, the pace has been amazing. So we had the first consensus meeting 5 or 6 years ago, which was one to define the pathology. So how we could differentiate it from Alzheimer's disease over here or a patient with CTE over here. So we could do that. So that worked straight. We got really nice criteria that which we said as a consensus we should apply for diagnosing CTE in pathology practice. We then had a second consensus, and that process was to do two things. One was to give these new criteria, we'd come up with a good shakedown. So do they work in practice? Can we really make them function for us? And then the second one was to look at, is there a way of what we call staging? So providing an estimate of the amount of pathology in the brain. And there was a proposal, and quite rightly, has done a lot of work on this and thought there were 4 different stages. There was a stage 1 where there's not much disease, and stage 4 at the other end where the brain was full of disease. And she felt that was a functional way to do it. And it's really important that we do try and figure these ways out, because that's the way we communicate and we understand how extensive the disease is.
And I
The
just want
reality
to
is,
for 1 second is that I don't think people understand outside of the world, like there's no one accepted definition of brain injury. There's no one accepted definition of concussion. Different organizations have different languages. I was really realizing if, an MRI machine in one location has, a technician and a language that's different from another technician. And there's so much communication that has to happen in the world of medicine and science with people coming from different perspectives. So it's not cut and dry out there definitions, in this space. So I'm sorry, go back to.
Yeah, but this is the important thing. This is where in pathology we really do try and nail down the language, nail down the definitions early on in a disease, because that way we know we're all looking at the right thing. And if you go back maybe 30 years, there was CTE existed back then, dementia pugilistica we called it back then, but we hadn't really defined what it was. So all sorts of things were thrown into the bag marked dementia pugilistica, which nowadays we wouldn't recognize. So there was a group of boxers which were studied by a famous pathologist psychiatrist, Chrysalis, back in the 70s, late 60s, 70s. And he said this is a group of boxers with dementia pugilistica, and he described the pathology in all these boxers. Well, that set has, that case series has been looked at again with modern CTE criteria, and actually quite a number of them didn't have what we would regard as CTE. So we had this kind of ragbag of stuff, the diagnoses, pathologies, which now we've actually taken and we've said, right, amongst all of these things, this is the pathology of CTE. This is what we recognize as the distinctive, different, really unique change we see related to head injury. Now, it's not the only problem we see in head injury, because we also see more Alzheimer's disease, we also see more Parkinson's disease, we also see more motor neuron disease. But the one that we can say and point at it and say that's to do with head injury, because that's the only time we see it, is CTE. So that's nailed.
Ask that in the chat. Is CTE seen in people without the history of head trauma?
There's been a lot of efforts to try and find it by going into a bit like our archive, which is a very rich archive for looking at people with brain injury. There are other archives which have been set up to look at dementia diagnoses. And so you would think if you're going to find CTE, you're going to find it in there. So several studies have gone on looking at big archives of dementia case material and looking for CTE and CTE pathologies in those dementia case materials. And the reality is virtually never has it been uncovered in these case series, unless you go back through the records, you find there's been a brain injury. I think there are 1 or 2 cases where people say they couldn't find a story of brain injury in their examples, but to be honest, I've looked at some of the illustrations they published on those cases, and it's not actually CTE they're reporting. So this comes down to definitions. So I think as far as we are at the moment, with the thousands of cases that have been looked at in dementia series and in normal aging controls and in sports athletes, etc., we're only seeing the pathology in people who we can identify a story of brain injury. So it's pretty strong so far. That's not to say that 10 years from now we might have moved our definition slightly, but at the moment, a history of head injury is the one unifying factor in all these cases.
And then how can we, and to continue on with the original question of how is CTE broken down currently in 2022?
Yeah, that's right. So as now we've defined the disease. The next thing we want to do is to communicate to each other how much disease we see in a brain. So if I am looking at a brain in Glasgow and I say this patient has CTE, I can use a form of words, a system, to be able to communicate to my colleagues in Boston or Miami or Cape Town how much pathology I'm seeing. And that's what we call staging. And again, Anne's first go at this was to say stage 1, not much. Stage 4, there's an awful lot. And there's stage 2 and 3 in between, depending on where the pathology was. Our second consensus process looked at, firstly, did the diagnostic criteria work? They did work really well. Secondly, did the staging system stand up to scrutiny? So when independent pathologists looked at the same cases and staged the pathology, estimated how much pathology was there, did we all come back with much the same answer? And the reality was no, we didn't. It really didn't work at all. The 4-stage system didn't stand up to that process. And so we did a bit of work afterwards to see if, well, is there some, we have to be able to come up with some words to quantify disease in people. We can't have people with not much disease being counted the same way as people with a lot of disease. And effectively, that's what we ended up doing. We dichotomized it to low stage disease or high stage disease. And that seems to work. We can differentiate low stage disease from high stage disease. We now have a criteria system for pathology colleagues to use to be able to classify the cases. So that's where we are now.
And what would you like to see next in the research part of that? Just, is it improvement on the technology? Is it just the ability to have more brains to research? Like, what do you think is the linchpin for us for the next advance in CTE research?
So I sadly, because we have nothing that gives us an insight into disease in life, so none of our special brain scans or blood tests or protein tests, none of these things really tell us what's happening in the brain the same way that looking at brains down a microscope does. So there's still a continued need to receive these brain donations and try and understand what's happening with these diseases. And I say to the families that every case I look at tells me something new, gives me another new insight into how we might be dealing with this disease. So that's really important. The other thing is we've got this kind of understanding of CTE at the moment. We've still got a bunch of questions to answer on that, like, is the head injury enough, or is there other things might happen as well? So, for instance, is head injury, it's a bad word to use, but is it the first hit? Is it the first thing that makes you increasingly likely to develop disease? But you need to do something else on top of it. So that might be lifestyle factors that we're talking about, these other risk factors. Maybe you need to have that included as well. Maybe you need something genetic.
Or maybe the age that you start, if you're starting at 5 versus starting at 19 playing a sport.
Yeah. And how much of a hit you take during your career and how you recover from. So there's a whole bunch of these questions that need to be addressed, and they're going to be difficult to answer, but we do need to answer them. The other thing is CTE, as we've kind of said, is just one of the problems, one of the pathologies, one of the outcomes that we see in people exposed to brain injury. We also see this higher risk of Alzheimer's disease, higher risk of motor neuron disease, higher risk of Parkinson's disease. And these are all distinctive pathologies. So now we need to figure out, what does brain injury do to instigate these pathologies, and does it look different to us? So does somebody who's had a brain injury and goes on to develop Parkinson's disease have a different pathology to somebody who develops Parkinson's disease without it? And that's going to be really important. So now we in our group are now less referring to CTE as the problem we're trying to unpick here, and we refer more to what we call TBI, related neurodegeneration, or TREND for short. And TREND covers all these diseases, one of which is CTE.
which is, I think I've seen it before. It's sort of it's a rainbow where you have just all of these along, and so train, TRAIN.
Trend, TREND, trend.
Trend. Oh, trend. Okay, so that's part of the trend study that you're doing, hence trend. And before we go into your own research, I think we have a little more time. We'll go on to your research in one second. How the third view is your thoughts on how organizations, and that's across all the brain injury organizations, how do we balance out this awareness? We want to encourage awareness of CTE. We want to encourage donation and of resources, and then also balancing out not terrifying people, and and from that view, it's, you want to sell the vignette, you want to sell the story, it's marketing, it's social media, it's awareness days, but you're also balancing out the mental health of people that have to process all this.
Yeah, so I mean, that's why, I mean, we've become acutely aware of that in the last several years, because we've had, sadly, more and more former footballers and rugby players who we've diagnosed with CTE, and people know about now and are being discussed, big high profile former, international football stars who've died with dementia and CTE. And that draws attention to the issues, and the conversation starts to begin about, where is this problem, how big is this problem? We also produced the research showing just, quantifying what the risk was. So saying that, for footballers, the risk was 3.5 times higher than it should be. That's a huge increase in risk. That's a really frightening increase of risk if you're a former footballer. And we realized when we sat down and were speaking to people while we were busy communicating this, these are the problems we were finding, this is the problem, this is the pathology. We needed to do something about support for people who were, dealing with this on a personal level. So when you speak to the former athletes, for instance, they would just sit and say, I'm scared, this information worries me, because I'm 45, I used to play rugby or football at a high level, and there's nothing I can do. And we would say, well, there is, of course there is. You've got, your whole life ahead of you. What about all these other things that are risks for dementia? What are we doing with these? And so suddenly they'd sit up and say, oh, actually, right, okay, I didn't realize. I thought the story I'd been told was that I had no prospects, no hope. Now you're telling me there is hope, which is why, to go on to our research, I'm always fond of a good acronym, you see. And sometimes the acronym comes before we actually get the title of the study sorted out. So with the study that we just launched, and the whole program of activity we've got at the moment, is this thing called Brain Hope. And the hope part of that stands for health outcomes in professional and elite athletes. So it's brain health outcomes in professional and elite athletes, Brain Hope. The idea being we're trying to inject hope rather than despair. We're not, we recognize there's nothing we can do for dementia once it's diagnosed. We don't understand this disease. There's a whole bunch of unknowns, but we do know some things, and some of those things are, some of your future is in your control. Sport has done what it's done to you, but take control, take hope. There's things we can do.
I think that's absolutely essential. So other research, other research projects that you're working on right now, and also wanted to discuss the Drake domestic violence one too.
Yeah. So that's really important. You and I have discussed often about the lack of attention, the lack of research there is to the issue of brain injury in women, whether it be brain injury in sport in women, or whether it be brain injury in women who develop or sustaining it from other circumstances. And sadly, that is the numbers of people exposed to intimate partner violence and traumatic brain injury and from domestic violence is incredible. So we took an advantage of a study which I'm part of, it's called the Prevent Dementia study, and the intention of it is to look at volunteers in a community aged between 40 and 59 and try and figure out in midlife what the signs are that might predict brain health in the future. So is there something in a brain scan, or something in a blood test, or something in the way our brains work when we sit down and chat to people that tells us in 15 years from now you're at risk of dementia? Because that's going to mean we can home in on those patients and those individuals and try and change the course of disease. Now, in this cohort, we were trying to figure out how we advance studies in brain injury. And of course, with the knowledge that around about a third of people, 25%, 30% of people have a history of intimate partner violence, I asked the question of this cohort of 700 individuals, how many of them do we have who have reported history of intimate partner violence? And lo and behold, about 150 to 160. Of those, about 100 with history of brain injury, often repetitive. And so that, suddenly unlocked a phenomenally important research study, which people have been waiting to try and design and get going. But here it was already sitting, ready to be analysed. So,
and so often it's like just asking the question, right?
Asking the question. So, there's I've got really good friends and colleagues that I'm working with and collaborating with in the US who are trying to design from the ground up a study which just 40 miles away was running already. So we could say, look, let's actually make this a theme of research. Let's try and unlock this. And as often these things do at the moment, we set it up as a PhD project. So the data are there. We just need somebody who's gifted and keen and motivated to work with us to analyze the data and bring it together. So really lucky. Natalie Jenkins, who's a PhD student in this, who you must meet someday. She was available and keen to come and work with us. And I contacted James Drake of the Drake Foundation and said, look, I know you're normally involved with sports brain injury research, but this is something else important. And I think this is something we should be trying to commit ourselves to. And he said, yep, no problem, I'll fund this PhD. So Nat has been running about a year now. And in this serendipitous cohort of people who are already participating in research, who we've uncovered, a number of them have problems with exposure to intimate partner violence, we're already seeing differences in midlife brain health and clinical outcomes compared to the people who've been recruited without that story. So we're beginning to see what's happening here now. And I think it's going to be incredible to see how that develops in the next year or so.
Absolutely. And I think in those cases that ties into the military work of the combination of PTSD and TBI and the chemical process of TBI increasing the risk for PTSD. And I think it's in those cross sections where we look. I mean, it makes the research harder, right? If you leave the sports population, but I think the value of
it does do because it does do because we're all complex people and all sorts of things are happening in life, and to some extent, sport is slightly easier because they're super high exposure and easily identifiable. But actually, sport is a pretty it's a pretty low participation. If you look at brain injury across the community and look at outcomes across the community, participation across the community, far more people are falling off bikes or falling off horses than turning up at casualty departments with brain injuries from contact sport. So I think we need to look at not just sport, but look at the wider community and try and figure out what's happening there. And as I say, sadly, in that wider community, there's a very big population who at home in domestic circumstances are exposed to head injury. And we need to, it's remarkable in 2022, nobody's really had a proper look to see what this might mean, let alone invest in the support that might be required for it.
The other population, Hope, Kent and I were speaking of Hope from Exeter with Hugh Williams, is the population that are incarcerated with a history of incarceration, and that grouping of people and the high traumatic brain injury in the lives that they have.
Yeah, I know that Hugh and Hope and colleagues are doing some fantastic work trying to just look at the issues with brain injury. I mean, it's phenomenally high rates of brain injury. And people say, well, it's the chaotic lifestyle, it's the lifestyle they lead. But some of this brain injury predates the development of lifestyle. So which is this the chicken and egg? Which way are we going to deal with this? So I think we need to understand just the prevalence of it and what contribution it has to their lifestyle and what's happening.
Another question I wanted to ask you, now that you have had a ban on heading, when I was remotely part of the team that was working on bringing that to the United States, and it was, banning on heading in American soccer, under 10, and it was, a huge deal for about 6 months, and now it's, past history, it's just done. Where are you? Are you seeing with banning heading in children under a certain age in the UK or just in Scotland? Are you seeing leagues responding to it? Is there drama around it? Are parents just accepting it? Where are you with that now?
It's mixed. So we're kind of about 2 years or so into that story that essentially what we did, we started looking at the dementia rates and saying there was a problem in football. And then we started thinking, well, where could that be heading? Particularly looking at youth levels, what's going on there. And some research we did, we found out that at under 12s in matches barely had the ball at all, and yet some of our coaches were putting all the kids through 20, 30 headers a week because one of the kids on Saturday might have to head the ball, and we said, well, that's just crazy. So let's just get rid of the heading in training. If a kid happens to, the ball happens to bounce off their head, we're not going to penalise them. We're not going to, have a penalty. We're just going to move on, carry on. So that was not difficult to introduce. There was some murmurs of, how would the kids ever score goals again, and that died down quite quickly when you explain to them that, to be honest, the kids aren't scoring goals with a head at that age anyway. So
right, exactly.
It's not. We're not going to lose anything there. So that wasn't such a big problem. But people seem to adopt it quite quickly. However, 2 years down the line is a good time to start looking at success, and not just sit back and go, well, thank goodness we solved that problem.
Right.
When we look at success, what we find out is that, coach, say for teenage years, they may do 10 headers with a lightweight ball. So what we find is that kids being kids are not just playing for their local, youth team, they're also playing for the school team, and they're playing for the, boys club team. And so when we were beginning to feedback that each of these coaches believes they're the coach for that child, and that if Jenny is going to be, at school soccer on Monday, she'll do 10 headers, and coach will insist on it. And then she's going to be at the club soccer on Wednesday, and another coach there will say, well, you're all doing 10 headers with me tonight. And I don't care, Jenny, if you say you did 10 on Monday, didn't do 10 with me, you're doing it now. So we're having to do a wee bit of, just polishing up with many of the coaches and teachers to say, look, it's these are kids. It's not how many headers you see, it's how many headers they've had, and that's what we're kind of focus on. And I don't think that'd be too difficult. But I think it's probably just they weren't perhaps taking on board that the kids were involved in so much activity. I think they all focused that the kids are theirs and nobody else's. The really exciting thing is that, having demonstrated to football that when you take heading away from young people, the game doesn't collapse. Kids don't suddenly go off to play,
Right.
table tennis because they can't head the ball anymore. If anything, the kids enjoy it more because it doesn't hurt so much. So having demonstrated the game doesn't collapse, the sport is now looking at the seniors and professionals and adults and saying, well, actually, maybe we could do something similar here. Not ban it, but is there a way of restricting exposure? So English professional football this season tried to bring in a policy where during the week they'd have no more than 10 headers in practice.
Wow. Oh, that's huge news. And that's
huge.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I remember when that, no live hit practices in our American football at the college levels, and some of the best teams were the ones not, having the players beat each other up all week long before the game.
And now it's had mixed success, because whilst the English Football League and the coaches are signed up to that, it's a great idea and all that, it's not an enforceable policy, it's an advisory policy, no more than 10 headers. And what happens is that as you get into the business end of the season and the games become more competitive and there's more riding on it, Liverpool are in European competition and they're going to have to win, and they're competing against a Spanish side who don't have their association telling them they can only head 10 times a week. So the coach reasonably for the English team is going to say, well, if these guys can hit it 30 times a week, we're going to hit it 30 times a week because we don't want to lose the advantage. So this is where in a global sport, you really need a global direction. So the English Football Association, the Scottish Football Associations, your progress in this has been amazing, been fantastic in the space of a couple of years. But we now need the global game to step up and start saying, well, what's happening in UK should be happening elsewhere, so that there's nobody feels they're being disadvantaged in the competition because their association has insisted they don't head it too often during the week. So I'm hoping that's the next thing that we're going to see, is that the global sport steps up and says, right, we're just going to take this on now.
And I do think that the even at the local level, pushing that every coach and every assistant coach had to have concussion education, and often people are going to be leaving the game, and that great hysteria, the sky's going to fall. People have short memories. The next time they sign their kids up, they're like, oh, this is just what we do. So I think that people have short memories of what they do, right?
The other thing is that particularly at youth level, the most important people are, well, the kids are obviously the most important people, but the most important decision makers for kids are the parents. And so, I often get asked by parents, what do I do, if my kid wants to play football? So we'll take them down to club and, launch them into it. It's great fun. But as you do that, look at the coach in the eye and ask them about heading, look the coach in the eye and ask about concussion management. And if he looks in any way shifty, take your kids and drop them off at the next club. And quickly the coaches will realize that they're only going to get parents bringing the kids to them if they're responsible and looking after the kids. And that, I think that's really important, because parents are saying, well, sure, that's all I need to do. So my daughter or my son can still go and play soccer or rugby and enjoy it. I'm not going to be a bad parent for not letting them play, but I can be a better parent by actually taking them to somewhere where we know they'll get looked after. So that's really effective, I think.
And do you think that fewer children are playing football in the UK since the heading rules came in?
No, I think participation levels, in sport, I've not looked at it formally, but I hear anecdotally that it's a struggle getting kids to participate in many things these days, just to get volunteers and get time and all
also
that.
had a pandemic.
Yeah, but I don't think it's anything to do with heading. In fact, when I thought it was a really good bit of when the heading story started to come out, the local news went along with a microphone and chatted to the parents and chatted to the kids and chatted to the coach. And coach said, great, happy with that. If the kids are happy, I'm happy. Parents said, well, I'm pleased because I didn't like watching them head the ball anyway. Most importantly, though, he asked the kids, and the kids said, oh, good, because I used to get a headache after football training. So I mean, that to me is that's we've done some good, because if kids are reporting a headache, presumably never mentioned it to the parents because they just thought that's what you get, and I'm not going to complain. But if they're reporting headache, they're reporting a sign of brain injury, they're reporting a sign of concussion. So they shouldn't have been going through that. So I think everybody's happy, as far as I can tell, that we've taken this thing away that nobody was really enjoying.
And I was with you in 2020, December 2019, where you were putting your reputation, your name, and you were the face pushing for this. And I think you were speaking to people that wanted to do the best thing, but at the time there was some thought of do we follow the American pathway on this? And I just want to give you credit for how personal you made that mission, and it happened because you supported it. So
I mean, in fairness, there was a really strong will, I think, in UK sport to try and look after the participants, particularly. I mean, obviously at the elite level, they're very concerned about them, but they're also concerned about grassroots. It's the kids, the boys and girls, the teens that are not just the future of the game, but they're the people who will stay engaged with the game and who will turn up to watch the Saturday afternoon matches. So I think there's just a genuine will for people, and all they need was all I think I did was nudge them with a bit of evidence. Sit down with them and say, this is what we're talking about, and this is how we can resolve it, and this solution is not going to kill your game. It's not going to kill, if anything, it's going to make it stronger, because people will think, well, they care about me, they care about my kids, so I'll play. So it seems, I mean, it's a very adult, very straightforward conversation, but it works.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you to putting your name in your face to that too. You're a very humble guy, but I saw the other side of it, and I want to thank you for that. And I guess it's interesting because we get so attached to sports. I'm a rabid Chelsea fan, and I love the sport, and people want their players to be healthy, and and these sports change. I mean, we get the sport that I watch, how it's played is always been the way it's been. And so many sports over the hundreds of years, they change. So I think there is more flexibility, and we get attached to our version of the game.
Yeah. And, I kind of use, in the football, soccer sense, the spray foam they use to mark out where the free kick should be taken from and where the defensive line should be. When that was first introduced, there were people saying, why, players should just know where to stand. It's like, yeah, it's not going to, nobody's going to, the game is still going to be the same. If anything, it'll be slightly better because people know how to play it properly. So, little things can happen and nothing, there's always a big fuss. I think as fans, we see things change and we think, no, I love the game this way. But then
it's my game. It's my game, and it's exactly that way, right?
Yeah. And often the people who shout loudest, the people who are least likely to ever play the game, or least likely to put their head online, literally. So, and 6 months later, as you say, half a season down, a season passes by and we've all forgotten about it. And so, with the kids, there was some mutterings. There was a lot of phone-ins to radio shows about the end of football, and England will never win another World Cup and all the rest of it. And 6 months, a year later, people had forgotten about it. It was just normal, and that's the way things happen. And I think it would be, the way I keep saying to people is that, let's imagine England do win, or Scotland may happen, you never know, do win the World Cup. Do we want to be in a position in 30, 40 years' time where, when we bring the team back to celebrate that success from 2022, half of them have got dementia, or some of them have even died with dementia? Or do we want a position where 30, 40 years now, we bring them back and they can all sit around and talk about the day and reminisce about how wonderful it was because we looked after them? And I think we'd far rather be in the second.
That's just such a wonderful way to wrap up this show. I can't agree with you more, and I appreciate all the work you do, and your level-headedness, your openness to work with other people, your listen to other people's perspective, and then your sense of calm, and you are a very humble guy, and I think you're one of the top people in the world, and I'm really honored to know you, and to I called you up, hey, can I come up to your lab? I mean, you've always been so open and willing to teach me. So I really, and I also want to say, when have a female staff and an amazing group of women, that you have under you and help you with your work.
Well, thanks so much. And it's interesting, calm, but you don't see me in the lab when things are going horribly wrong. It's not always so calm. And yeah, and we as we've got an open door. Anybody can come in anytime. Just give us a call up. Even during COVID, we tried to make sure people could come and get access to us, and if that meant a Zoom call, we could just wander around and chat in the lab on a Zoom, or we look for the windows where life was opening up again, bring people in to let them see what we do, because we need to I think people need to understand all the different aspects of this, and there's no better way of doing it than actually coming in and having a coffee and seeing what we do. So you're always welcome back.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I do appreciate your work in this field and look forward to the results. When do you sort of expect to drop the next results from the studies that you're doing, so we know to look out? Okay, so very pregnant soon, so we'll keep our eyes out. So thank you again. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we'll be back next week with our next show, and I will have this video processed and up on YouTube by next week. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
We appreciate your time.
No, thank you. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again, and hopefully in person soon.
Hopefully, yeah, the world's opening up.
Okay, take care. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye now.